The courtroom was silent. Every breath, every shuffle of paper, every whisper seemed deafening against the weight of history pressing down on that space. At the center sat a woman, not just any woman, but a survivor. She had endured the darkest abyss humanity had ever constructed. And now, decades later, she was about to face the man who had tormented her. A man who once believed he would never be held accountable. This is the story of the survivor who confronted her Nazi torturer in court. It is not a tale of revenge, nor is it one of easy justice. It is a story about memory, about the scars that never fade, and about the extraordinary strength it takes to look into the eyes of cruelty and speak the truth. Over the next hour, we will journey through her childhood, her deportation to a world designed to break her, her desperate struggle to survive inside the concentration camp, and the years of silence that followed. We will walk beside her as she rebuilds her life, as the world tries to move on, and as shadows of the past refuse to fade. And finally, we will sit with her in that courtroom, decades later, where justice is no longer abstract, but living, breathing, and staring back across the aisle. If history teaches us anything, it is that silence is dangerous and forgetting is unforgivable. Join us as we uncover this forgotten confrontation, and make sure you subscribe to this channel so you never miss stories that remind us why history matters, and why truth, no matter how delayed, must always be spoken. She was only a child when the world she knew was torn away. Born in a small European town, her life before the war was unremarkable but happy, filled with the smells of fresh bread from her mother's kitchen, the laughter of siblings playing in narrow streets, and the warmth of a close-knit community. But in the late 1930s, that innocence was systematically stripped away. Anti-Jewish decrees crept in like a suffocating fog. First came the curfews, then the yellow star sewn onto clothes, then the confiscation of property. Neighbors who once exchanged greetings now crossed the street in silence, or worse, spat venomous words as though her family's very existence had become a crime. The night the soldiers came was not a surprise. The rumors had been circulating for months, but it was a shock all the same. Boots thundered on cobblestones, fists pounded on doors, and shouts in a language of command echoed through narrow alleys. Her family was herded out of their home with only a small suitcase each. The smell of fear hung in the air, mingled with the stench of diesel from waiting trucks. She clutched her mother's hand as tightly as she could, not yet comprehending that this was the beginning of her descent into hell. The train journey lasted days. The cattle car was crammed with people, suffocating, filthy, and devoid of hope. There was barely enough room to sit, and the only source of air was a small slit near the ceiling. Children cried until their throats went dry. The elderly collapsed in corners, and prayers rose like desperate whispers, swallowed by the rattling of the tracks. She would never forget the smell, a mixture of sweat, urine, and despair that clung to her for years afterward. When the train screeched to a halt, the doors flung open, and armed men shouted at them to get out. Bright lights blinded her eyes, and dogs barked furiously, straining at their leashes. They had arrived at the camp, a place whose name would forever be synonymous with death. She didn't know it yet, but this barbed wire world was designed to erase her, body and soul. The first selection was chaos. Men to the left, women and children to the right. She clung desperately to her mother's skirt, refusing to let go. A soldier shouted and shoved, and for a fleeting moment she thought they would be torn apart forever. But by chance, or perhaps some twist of fate, they were herded together into the line marked for forced labor. Others, friends, neighbors, entire families, were sent straight to the gas chambers. She did not know it that night, but she would never see many of them again. Inside the camp, the transformation was swift and merciless. Her hair was shaved off, her clothes stripped, her identity reduced to a number tattooed on her arm. She stared at the ink, trembling, as if the needle had pierced not just her skin but her very humanity. The guards barked orders in a language she barely understood, and any hesitation was met with blows. Hunger gnawed at her constantly, a pain that became her constant companion. But worse than hunger was the fear, the sense that every day, every hour, every moment might be her last. And yet, amid the horror, there was a flicker of defiance. She resolved silently, deep inside herself, that she would not give them what they wanted. They wanted her broken, faceless, erased. She would survive somehow, but survival in a place like this was never guaranteed, and soon she would come face to face with the man whose shadow would follow her for the rest of her life, her torturer. The camp was not just a prison, it was a machine. Every brick, every fence post, every barking order was designed to strip human beings of their dignity and transform them into nothing more than tools, disposable cogs in a vast, brutal system. The air itself seemed poisoned, thick with smoke from chimneys that never ceased to burn, and with it came the stench of death. Days blurred into one another. The siren wailed at dawn, dragging the prisoners from restless sleep on wooden planks, and within moments they were herded outside for roll call. Hours could pass as they stood motionless in freezing winds or under the scorching sun, waiting for names and numbers to be read, for punishments to be dealt. The guards knew that suffering was not just in the beatings or the shootings, but in the endless monotony of degradation. It was during one of these roll calls that she first noticed him. His presence was unmistakable. Tall, uniform immaculate, his boots gleaming as if polished with obsession. His name was whispered among the prisoners with dread, though many dared not speak it aloud. He had a reputation not merely for cruelty, but for a kind of sadistic creativity. Where others followed orders mechanically, he seemed to take pleasure in inflicting pain. She remembered the way his eyes scanned the rows of prisoners, sharp and predatory, searching for the smallest sign of weakness. A cough, a stumble, a glance held too long, any of these could draw his wrath. The first time she met his gaze, it felt like ice searing into her chest. He smiled faintly, a chilling reminder that here in this place, life and death rested on whims. Work was backbreaking. She was sent to carry heavy stones from one side of the camp to the other, a task designed to exhaust, but with no real purpose. Guards patrolled constantly, shouting insults, striking those who faltered. Hunger carved into her body, making her bones protrude beneath the striped uniform. Yet the greatest torment was knowing that this officer, this man who held power over her every movement, delighted in her suffering. One afternoon, as the prisoners staggered beneath their burdens, he walked among them, his whip dangling casually in his hand. He stopped beside her, watching as she struggled to lift a stone twice her size. With a smirk, he pressed the whip against her cheek, forcing her to look up. "Faster," he muttered in a language heavy with authority. She tried, her legs trembling, but the stones slipped crashing to the ground. His laughter rang out, followed by the crack of leather across her back. She fell to her knees, biting her lip until blood filled her mouth, refusing to cry out. To show pain was to give him satisfaction. That night she lay on her bunk, her body aflame with bruises, and vowed silently that he would not break her. Yet deep down, fear seeped into every thought. This man was not just another faceless guard. He was becoming her tormentor, her shadow. Every day she dreaded his gaze, and every day she braced herself for the next cruelty he might devise. The camp was relentless, a place where time seemed frozen, where weeks felt like years. And though she did not know it then, the connection forged in those moments, victim and tormentor, survivor and oppressor, would not be confined to barbed wire and watchtowers. Decades later, their paths would cross again, in a place far removed from this hell, under the eyes of justice. But for now, in that winter of captivity, she had only one goal: endure the next day. Each day in the camp was a battle between life and death, fought not only against hunger and exhaustion, but against despair itself. The girl learned quickly that survival demanded both cunning and endurance. To show weakness was dangerous, to show defiance even worse. Yet she also discovered something unexpected. Fragments of humanity that managed to survive in the cracks of brutality. In the barracks, whispers of encouragement passed between prisoners like contraband. An older woman pressed a crust of bread into her hand one night, murmuring, "Live. That is your revenge." Another taught her how to wrap rags around her feet to endure the snow, how to chew slowly so a thin soup felt like a meal. These small acts, invisible to their captors, became lifelines. But the officer, her tormentor, seemed determined to crush even those fragile threads. His presence was everywhere, a shadow in the roll call square, a figure looming by the worksite. He punished not only mistakes, but also moments of hope. Once when a prisoner hummed a lullaby under her breath, he forced the entire group to stand at attention for hours until the woman collapsed. His cruelty was not random. It was calculated, designed to remind them that nothing human was allowed to flourish. Still, she resisted in ways that could not be seen. She memorized faces, names, tiny details of those around her, as if preserving their existence might defy the annihilation. At night, when the others slept, she whispered stories from her childhood to herself, clinging to memories of her mother's kitchen, her father's laughter. Memory became her shield, her way of insisting that she was more than a number inked into her skin. The seasons shifted, though time was hard to measure. Winter brought bone-deep cold, summer unbearable heat, but hunger was constant. She learned to scavenge, to trade morsels of food, to save strength whenever possible. Her body grew thin, her cheeks hollow, but her spirit, though scarred, endured. Each morning she rose when ordered. Each evening she collapsed onto the bunk, silently marking another day survived. And then came the day when the unimaginable happened. The camp gates opened, not to admit new prisoners, but to reveal soldiers in unfamiliar uniforms. Liberation. Chaos erupted as the guards fled, abandoning their posts, their weapons, their prisoners. For the first time in years, she breathed without fear of a command, without the weight of eyes watching her every move. Yet freedom was not simple. The world beyond the barbed wire did not erase what she had endured. Her body was frail, her family mostly gone, her memories heavy with grief. Liberation meant survival, but it also meant carrying scars that would never fade. She would never again be the carefree child who once laughed in sunlit streets. Still, she walked out of the camp alive, a triumph against all odds. And though she tried to push the past into the shadows of memory, one figure lingered, refusing to disappear. The officer who had delighted in her pain, whose cold smile haunted her dreams. She thought she had escaped him forever, but fate had other plans. Decades later, his name would resurface, and she would be asked to do the unthinkable, to face him once more, this time not as a helpless prisoner, but as a witness. Liberation was not the end of her ordeal. It was the beginning of a different kind of struggle, one that unfolded not behind barbed wire, but in the vast silence of the world that had moved on without her. She left the camp a shadow of herself, emaciated, trembling, her eyes too old for her young face. Allied soldiers gave her food, blankets, and medical care, but nothing could restore the family she had lost. The first weeks after liberation were a haze of hospitals and refugee centers. Survivors searched desperately for familiar names on lists, pinned to walls, clinging to rumors that loved ones had been found alive in distant towns. She searched too, with a mixture of dread and hope, but each time her heart sank. Her parents were gone, her siblings gone. The silence of their absence was more unbearable than the screams she had endured in the camp. She drifted from one displaced person's camp to another, guided by aid workers who tried to piece together the shattered lives of millions. Some survivors found solace in groups, in prayer, in clinging to one another. For her, solace was harder to find. At night, when she closed her eyes, she saw the camp gates, the chimneys, and the cold stare of the officer who had inflicted torment upon her. Even in freedom, he lived rent-free in her mind, Years passed. She eventually emigrated, starting anew in a land that promised opportunity and safety. She learned the language, worked tirelessly, and built a modest life. Outwardly, she was resilient. A woman who married, raised children, and contributed to her community. Inwardly, the past was a weight she carried silently. She rarely spoke of the camp, even to her family. When asked about the faded numbers tattooed on her arm, she would give only the simplest answer. It was a time of war. Some things are too painful to explain. The world, too, seemed eager to move on. Newspapers reported on rebuilding economies, on new conflicts brewing in other corners of the globe. Trials were held for a handful of prominent Nazis, but many others disappeared into the shadows, changing their names, blending into ordinary life. Some became farmers, some businessmen, some even neighbors in unsuspecting towns. Justice was inconsistent, often delayed, sometimes denied. She carried the gnawing question, what became of him? The officer whose face haunted her dreams had. He vanished into obscurity. Had he slipped away across a border, living comfortably while his victims struggled to stitch together broken lives? The thought enraged her, yet she tried to bury it. Raising children, she told herself, was her true act of defiance. Survival was victory enough. Decades rolled by, the numbers on her arm fading with her skin, but the memories never softened. Then, one day, news reached her that shook her carefully constructed peace. Trials were reopening, new evidence was surfacing. Old men, frail and wrinkled, were being dragged before courts, accused of crimes committed when they wore black uniforms and carried whips, and among the names whispered in newspapers and survivor networks, one leapt out at her like a ghost tearing through time. His name, the officer. He was alive. The silence she had maintained for decades cracked open. The past demanded her voice. Would she testify? Could she stand in front of him again, no longer the trembling girl, but a woman with truth as her weapon? The choice was hers, and soon she would make it. The news spread like wildfire through survivor circles. Another Nazi was to be tried. Decades had passed since the war, yet prosecutors were determined to pursue every living perpetrator, no matter how old, no matter how frail. The world had changed, but the crimes remained carved into history, waiting for acknowledgement, waiting for justice. For her, the revelation was like a wound reopening. His name was there, printed in black and white, attached to charges of murder, cruelty, and participation in the machinery of genocide. Her tormentor, the officer with the polished boots and the cruel smile, had been found. He was not a ghost, not a nightmare conjured by memory, but a man still breathing, living somewhere in Europe, as if the past had no claim on him. Investigators reached out to survivors, asking for testimony. Many were old now, voices weakened by time, memories clouded by age. Yet she felt clarity sharper than ever. She knew his face, his gestures, the sound of his voice barking orders. She could not forget, even if she wanted to. The thought of speaking aloud what had been buried for so long terrified her, but also ignited a fire she hadn't felt in years. The preparation was grueling. Prosecutors pored over camp records, cross-referencing dates and names, piecing together the puzzle of atrocities committed decades earlier. She sat with them for hours, recounting details she had once sworn she would never revisit. Every word felt like ripping open scars, but she endured because she understood that history demanded witnesses. Without testimony, memory would fade. Without memory, justice would die. Still, she wrestled with doubt. Would her words matter? Would people believe her? Would he even remember her? Or would she be just another nameless prisoner in his long list of victims? These questions gnawed at her, yet she refused to back down. The trial was not only about him, it was about truth, about honoring the millions who had no voice left to speak. The day came when she boarded a plane to the country where the trial would be held. As she gazed out the window, The landscape below reminded her of journeys long past, train rides in cattle cars, forced marches through unfamiliar fields. But this journey was different. She was no longer a powerless child. She was a survivor carrying testimony like a weapon, determined to pierce the shield of lies and denial. The courthouse was a stark, modern building, a far cry from the crumbling barracks of the camp. Yet the air inside was heavy with history. Reporters crowded the steps, cameras flashing. Inside, lawyers shuffled papers, judges adjusted robes, and translators prepared their headsets. For her, none of it mattered. Her mind was fixed on one thing, him, and then the moment came. The guards escorted an old man into the room. His body was frail now, his back bent with age, his skin lined with wrinkles. He looked nothing like the towering figure she remembered. But when she saw his eyes, cold, sharp, predatory even in old age, the years fell away. She was back in the camp, a stone slipping from her hands, the crack of a whip across her back. Her breath caught, but she did not falter. She straightened her spine, steadying herself. Tomorrow she would take the stand. Tomorrow, the girl who had once been voiceless would finally speak. The courtroom was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses on your chest and fills your ears with its own weight. She stepped forward, each footfall echoing on the polished floor, her heart hammering in a rhythm that felt both familiar and foreign. This was a place of justice, yet it carried the gravity of decades of injustice. For a fleeting moment, she imagined herself back in the camp, the rows of prisoners, the glare of her tormentor, the endless cold that had seeped into her bones. But she was no longer that child. She was a witness, a bearer of truth, and she would speak. The judge called the court to order, and the room hushed even further. She took her seat, facing the man who had haunted her dreams, the officer who had once believed himself untouchable. His eyes met hers for a moment, flickering with recognition, then shifting quickly to mask whatever emotion might lie beneath. The years had aged him, bent him, but they had not erased the cruelty he carried. When her name was called, she rose. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward her. Cameras clicked, scribes scratched notes, and the air seemed to thicken with expectation. She drew a deep breath and began. Her words were measured but piercing. She described the girl she had been, the family torn from her, the journey through the train cars, the first steps into the camp. She spoke of hunger, of the cold, of the endless beatings, of the crushing weight of fear. Every memory was a wound reopened, yet she pressed on, knowing that silence would dishonor the millions who had no chance to speak. Then came the moments she had dreaded most, recounting the officer's specific cruelties. She described how he selected prisoners for punishment, how he wielded his authority with meticulous malice, how his presence alone made survival an act of defiance. The courtroom seemed to shrink as she spoke, the past bleeding into the present, the echoes of screams and the smell of smoke and despair filling her mind. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, a frail body attempting to hide decades of guilt or denial. She did not flinch. She continued, detailing the courage she had found in herself and in those around her. She spoke of the small acts of defiance, the stolen crumbs of bread, the whispered encouragements that had kept countless lives alive. Tears welled in the eyes of some in the audience, but she did not allow herself to cry. Her voice remained steady, carrying the weight of history across the room. She was not only telling her story, she was testifying for the millions who would never have a voice. The prosecutor asked questions, each designed to clarify, to confirm, to paint a detailed portrait of the horrors committed. She answered honestly, without exaggeration, without dramatization. The facts were enough. The memories themselves were a damning indictment. Finally, the officer was given the chance to respond. His words were feeble, evasive, defensive. He claimed forgetfulness, the fog of age, the pressures of following orders. But the courtroom was not moved by excuses or the passage of time. Justice was patient, but it was unrelenting. When the judge announced the verdict, the room held its collective breath. Guilty. The word landed like a hammer, both final and symbolic. For her, it was not a triumph of vengeance, but a vindication of truth. A reckoning long overdue, she sat back, exhausted, a lifetime of fear and silence finally released. She had faced him, spoken the unspoken, and emerged with her dignity intact. The courtroom became a space where history and memory converged, where justice, however delayed, had a voice. Outside the courthouse, the world carried on, unaware of the quiet heroism that had unfolded within those walls. She returned to her life, carrying both relief and grief, knowing that the past would never leave her entirely, but that she had transformed it. She had transformed herself. This was more than a personal victory. It was a testament to the power of survival, the necessity of remembrance, and the moral imperative to confront evil wherever it lingers. She had shown that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. And now, decades after the war, her story serves as a beacon. To bear witness is to honor those lost, to ensure that history does not repeat itself, and to remind the world that accountability cannot be erased by time. If you have been moved by her courage, reflect on the stories that remain untold, the voices still waiting to be heard. Share this story, discuss it, and let it resonate, because the lessons of the past are the safeguards of our future. And if you want to uncover more truths hidden in history, more stories that demand our attention, subscribe now, because memory is our responsibility, and every voice matters. Her journey had begun in fear and ended in courage. The girl who once trembled in the shadows of barbed wire had become a woman who spoke truth to power. And through her, the world was reminded that even in the darkest chapters of humanity, light survives, fierce, unyielding, and unforgettable.